Thank you for all those lovely introductions in the chat. I'm Elizabeth Perry. I'm part of the Communion Forest team. And with Climate Stewards, we are co-hosting this webinar. And we are very, very pleased to welcome you to this webinar for potential funding partners for this new initiative.
Just a text from my
connecting
colleague.
Across the communion partners in carbon sequestration. I think this partnership that we'll be describing today between the Communion Forest and Climate Stewards has been long in the dreaming. It's very exciting for us to see it coming to fruition and to be sharing it outwards. One thing we really want to stress, we're in a pilot phase, so we are learning as we go and refining as we go. So feedback and comments and questions are very welcome. So for a long time, we have known, Climate Stewards and us in the Communion Forest, we've known for a long time that between us, the Anglican Communion and Climate Stewards, we have the potential to enable new, small-scale, high-quality community tree growing projects funded by carbon offsetting or carbon sinking, however you wish to describe it. So how so? Well, between us, we have the three necessary ingredients. So across the Anglican Communion, there are many Anglicans who care passionately about the environment and want to engage in practical tree growing initiatives. So the second ingredient is that also across the Anglican Communion, there are individuals, there are parishes, there are dioceses, in some cases, whole provinces that are on net zero pathways. The Church of England is one of those provinces, but there are others, Church of Canada, Scottish Episcopal Church, others who have a determination to work towards net zero. And they are seeking to reduce their carbon footprints, but recognize the need to offset what they cannot reduce. And so with many other organizations across the world also rushing to meet net zero targets, there's a growing shortage of high quality carbon offsets and an increased risk of greenwashing resulting from the purchase of poor quality carbon offsets. And so there's a pressing need for more reputable, high quality carbon projects. So that's the second element. And the third element, the third ingredient is Climate Stewards, who are a UK-based charity which is passionate about helping people to measure and reduce and offset their carbon footprint. They've been offering high quality carbon offsets for a long time now, since 2007. And there are several things that make Climate Stewards distinctive and why they were particularly of interest to us as the Communion Forest. So the first thing is that Climate Stewards works with local partners on small-scale, community-based projects that are beneficial not just to biodiversity, but for sequestering carbon, but they're also about benefiting the community, benefiting biodiversity is a whole package. They're small scale, they're the kind of scale that we're going to be working at. They're used to working at church level. Climate Stewards is also part of the Arosha family of organizations caring for God's creation around the world. And they also have the established seal of approval, which you'll be hearing about, a standard which provides a framework for developing and implementing robust, sustainable, transparent, community-led projects, carbon projects in the majority world. So this pilot partnership between the Communion Forest and Climate Stewards provides the opportunity to bring these three pieces together. We are hoping that through this pilot and hopefully beyond the pilot into the longer term, It will increase the number of small-scale, high-quality, community-led Anglican tree-growing projects, initiatives, which, as I say, they're beneficial to local communities and biodiversity, as well as sequestering carbon. It will enable Anglicans in the global north, individuals, churches, dioceses, to buy high-quality carbon offsets as part of their own carbon reduction strategies. And they have the added advantage, of course, of being beneficial to fellow Anglicans and their wider communities and to nature. And thirdly, it will enable climate stewards to scale up the excellent work they've been doing for a while. So last week, we held the webinar for potential growing partners. So equivalent webinar, but for the people who might be interested in doing the growing. And I think it's fair to say we've got a lot of interest of potential partners. So this webinar looks at the other side of it. This is the one for people who might be interested in helping to fund some of these new activities. So let me just run through what we're going to be covering in this webinar. So we're going to start section 1. We're going to be looking at what's the Climate Stewards Seal of Approval? What might the projects look like that you might choose to buy, that you want, we're asking people to buy into? What is the process that growing partners have to go through? And how is carbon sequestration measured? So that's all about what is the rigor of the approach that Climate Stewards takes. And then we'll have an opportunity for your questions. We'll then move on to section 2, which is about the funding side of it. So we'll be looking at where will the money come from? How much do we need to raise? What's that money used for? Can you use your donation for carbon offsetting? And then again, an opportunity for your questions to us, but also our questions to you. And then we're going to just talk about some timelines just briefly at the end to finish up. So as you'll be aware, we are recording, so we can share this afterwards. So if you don't want to be visible on a recording, please take your camera off, although I think it really records the main screen. So let me, without further ado, hand over to Caroline, who is the Director of Climate Stewards.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you for your welcome, and hello, everybody. Really great to see you all. As Elizabeth has said, I'm Caroline Pomeroy. I'm the Director of Climate Stewards, and I'm here today with my colleagues, who you may see on the screen, Alice, Corrie, who works with me, and Adrian Frost, who also has developed and has been very involved in the development of the Seal of Approval. So these are the three faces from Climate Stewards here today. So we wanted to tell you a bit of sort of background really on the Seal of Approval. Some of you, I can see some faces here, people who are already familiar with this, one or two of our existing partners, or people who've been involved with those partnerships in the past, and others who probably haven't come across it. So just to outline what it's all about. When Climate Stewards started, which is now about 15 years ago, Climate Stewards was a project of A Rocha, and we were set up, it was before any of us were working for Climate Stewards, but the organization was set up in order to develop carbon offsetting projects, or really to generate funds for A Rocha projects initially. And what they realized very quickly was that there was no good standard available for the sorts of community-based, small-scale, often church-connected or Christian-linked projects which brought multiple benefits to people and places on the ground. As you will probably know, there are some big standards out there, the gold standard, Vera, VCS, Plan Vivo, which is a slightly smaller standard but still pretty big. And all of these standards, what we rapidly realized, or I realized when I started this job, was that they are far too big for the kinds of projects that we're working with. They're extremely expensive. They cost tens and tens of thousands of dollars to put projects through the standards, and they involve an enormous amount of administrative overheads, which slightly detracts from the reality of what we want to do, which is get as much money as possible and support to the kinds of community projects that we want to be working with. So essentially, some years ago now, we started to work on our own standard. It's called the Seal of Approval. We use the same published data that everybody else uses, the same methodologies around how you calculate carbon sequestration rates, but we try and in every way make this standard more appropriate and usable by the kinds of partners we're working with. So just the general principles for standard for carbon offsetting that are embodied in this standard, I've listed them here. So first of all, any offset project must be additional. What that means is that the project wouldn't have happened without this funding. So if a farmer or a church or a school was going to plant trees anyway, and perhaps the government or some other project, some other scheme was going to fund that tree planting, or they were going to do it off their own bat, then there is no additionality. So one of the key components or criteria for a Seal of Approval project is it must be additional. We need to be able to demonstrate additionality. And one of the series of questions that we ask is about additionality. The second one is that it must be permanent. And that means in the context of a tree growing project, that the trees, there are two types of permanence. One is that the trees are genuinely permanent, i.e. you're creating or regenerating a new forest. So these are newly planted trees which are going to stay there for the rest of their lives. It's permanent forestry. The other version of that, or the other type of scheme that we support, is a commercial timber scheme, but where there is an assumption, an understanding that any trees which are harvested, first of all, are used for construction or furniture or uses in where that carbon will remain locked up in the carbon rather than burnt or rotting. And secondly, that they will be replanted immediately so that there's a permanent change of land use to tree growing. And the third kind of key criteria is no leakage. And leakage is about where you draw the project boundaries. And for example, in tree planting, the classic example is if there's a piece of land which is currently used for agricultural production, and the landowner decides to change that and grow trees, they then go to another piece of land down the road, chop down the trees and plant their crops there. That's leakage. That's when there is no net gain in the carbon sequestration. So we need to be clear, and we would ask questions around, is there any leakage in this project? So those are the three criteria that every offset project around the world should meet. Whether they do is another question, but that's what they should be doing. There are other things which all offset projects are aiming for, but are particularly important to us. First of all, it's they're accurate, so that our calculations are accurate in terms of how much carbon we are assuming gets sequestered or mitigated by the project. Then that everything is transparent. We try very hard to make all our calculations, all our assumptions very clear and obvious so that anybody can discover what the basis of our assumptions is, what the baseline was, what we're measuring, what we're not measuring, what the implications are, and how the figures are calculated. All our measurements are deliberately very conservative because we're dealing with small-scale, community-based projects where the risk tends to be higher. There are all sorts of things that can go wrong with growing trees, as you will be fully aware, I'm sure. So we build into the process a risk analysis, a risk matrix, which we carry out with the project partner as part of the Seal of Approval process, which goes through lots of areas of risk. So that's sort of technical risk around the project, it's maybe economic risk, political risk, climate risk, all the other risks that are associated with getting these trees to maturity. And we knock off a risk buffer. So it's quite a large percentage, usually, often 20–30%, which we hold back. We don't count when we're calculating the expected carbon sequestration, so that we can be really confident that what we are counting is something that should be achievable. The project must be sustainable, which means it needs to be fully owned by and embedded in the local community, yes, generating benefits, multiple benefits for the people and places where the trees are growing. As you will know, trees bring many benefits, and that is likely to include some element of a source of income. So that might be fruiting trees or other benefits that trees bring in terms of things that can be garnered from the trees, whether that's the bark or other parts of the tree that can be used by the community. There may be some financial benefit in terms of percentage of the crop, of the tree crop being harvested for timber in the future. Quite apart from the obvious benefits of soil stabilization and erosion control and shade, and benefits to biodiversity. So those are all key components of a seal of approval project. The next slide talks a little bit about the sort of pilot projects we're looking for. So for this pilot scheme, which, as Elizabeth has mentioned, and some of you will have seen and read about before, we've got a small amount of seed funding from a grant, but other money will be necessary to fund these projects. So what we're looking for are up to 5 small scale, high quality community tree growing projects. And when we say small scale, it's pretty small. We're talking about 1/2 to 2 hectares, and 1/2 to 2, that's a couple of football pitches in size. It's not massive. It's around. It might fit well with the land around the perimeter of a church or a school, for example, in the majority world. We're looking for sites on church and school land, possibly training institutions if you have those. But we're looking for sites which are homogeneous, so specific sites often with a fence or a clear boundary around them. As some of you will know, and you will have seen on our website, we also do work with aggregated sites where we have a group of smallholder farmers planting smaller numbers of trees on their land. But for this pilot, we are focusing on church and school sites, which are very easy to identify, to manage, to deal with. The project proposals can include a mix of permanent and commercial timber trees. I've mentioned that before. And we measure and count the carbon on those in a slightly different fashion, which we can explain in a moment. We will be looking for a majority of indigenous tree species. That's what we ask our partners to look for. And in many cases, they are able to identify and work and find indigenous trees, which are often as effective or even more effective in terms of growing fast.
This is a presentation.
Generating.
There would have been the
but they may include other tree species which will provide trees for income and food crops, for example, which I mentioned earlier, and also timber. So those are the sort of basic criteria for the pilot project.
So recording, please.
Here's an example on the next slide, just of one of our partners in Kenya. So we have the project partner in Kenya, southeastern Kenya, around Kitui, Matomo and Kitui. So this is an example of one of the sites that we fund. You can see it's in the compound of a church. There is a fence around the outside. The church congregation and youth groups have been involved in planting and maintaining the trees. And in this case, they're a species called Melia volkensii, which is a local indigenous species which grows, as you can see, tall and straight, a bit like a eucalyptus, which is what lots of people would like to be planting, but is not great in terms of biodiversity and other environmental implications. And actually, they find that this works really well and provides a very good timber crop, and all the other benefits that trees provide. So the seal of approval process, which we will talk through in much more detail if you become someone who would like to be one of these partners. Essentially, we would send you an application pack, and that application pack includes quite a lot of documents. First of all, there will be due diligence carried out on the partner organisation, and the partner in this case would be either the local partner, so the partner in the majority world, or sometimes it's the sort of sponsoring partner, as it were, in the UK or elsewhere. But essentially, it's ensuring that the partner organisation on the ground has capacity, and I think in this case it will be the local partner, has capacity to carry out this kind of project, that they have good, rigorous financial controls, that they have the right people in place, that they are able to carry out a project of this type and scale. The additionality assessment I mentioned before, so this is asking questions which are aimed at identifying whether or not this project is truly additional. Are we actually locking up extra carbon out of the atmosphere, or would this have happened anyway? Because we have to be able to show that this is extra carbon sequestration. The application form asks loads of questions around the local partners, from the local partners' perspective, including things around land ownership, all the sort of issues that they will need to think about in terms of what they're proposing to plant, where they're proposing to plant it, what was there already, have they thought about how they're going to water those trees if the rains don't come, what about the goats and the pests and the fire and the theft and all those risks that are associated with tree growing, how are they going to monitor and report and evaluate what they're doing. So lots of questions which we hope will sort of tease out many of the issues that may or may not have been thought about before. The risk buffers, again, I've talked about that. That's an analysis that we do with the partner to make sure that we've accounted for all the risks and hopefully they can mitigate against some of them. A work plan, just again, it ensures that the partner has really thought through how they can actually implement this. Have they thought about the timing? Have they actually got started soon enough so they're ready to plant when the rains come? Those kind of issues. Who's going to be there on site at which periods? All that kind of question. And a budget. Very important, obviously. We again provide a sort of pro forma budget with lots and lots and lots of different lines setting out all the different activities within the project. Again, trying to help our partners think through all the aspects of what they might need to spend money on and what we need to allow for. And here's a summary of what's in that budget. In the first couple of years, clearly that's when the majority of the expenditure takes place. We need to make sure that the local partner has good local forestry advice, ideally from people who've really, well, it needs to be from an organisation or individual who has practical on the ground experience of this type of scheme, that they have an understanding of a really biodiverse forest environment, not just commercial forestry. What have they, have they allowed for training? What are they doing about training? Working with partners, working with the church, working with schools, etc., for training, practical things, but also theological training. Why are we planting these trees? What is God saying about trees and the environment and our responsibility towards it? How can we be part of that? How, what preparations need to be made for the land, for the planting? Where are those seedlings going to be sourced? How much does that cost? How are they going to get there? Will they need fencing? How much does that cost? Who's going to build it? How much does getting water to the site cost if that's necessary? Is that definitely necessary, or is that just a contingency backup? Have they built in a payments for ecosystem services or other incentives? So that's a opportunity to reward the individual or school or landowner for the fact that they are, as it were, giving up their land for these trees. And in some cases, it's recommended or required by the people on the ground to say, yeah, this will make this project really fly. This will be good. This will help people to really be motivated to keep the trees growing. It may be a small financial incentive at certain periods. So, for example, year 0, the planting year, and then after 3 years, and then after 5 or 6 or 10 years in the future. So it's a small reward to basically based on the number of trees still growing. It may be another sort of incentive, for example, some extra training. In 1 or 2 of our partners are providing training in beekeeping and some of the equipment towards the beekeeping, beehives and suits and things like that, which is another incentive to keep people invested in the project and give them genuine benefits from having the trees there. And what provision for ongoing support and monitoring are they putting in place? And are they, and another budget line is the beating up. So that means replacing dead trees, seedlings in the first year or 2, which inevitably there will be some losses. So we always build that into the budget process, replacing any initial losses. In ongoing years, and generally our budgets run for 15 years, we need to make sure the trees keep growing. So and it's really important that there is more support and monitoring going on. We need to allow for the cost of that, for the staff cost, the time, the travel, etc., for any payments that need to be made to the partners for incentivizing them to keep committed to this project and ongoing training, so that the budget just allows you and your partner to really think carefully about all the different aspects of the costs of this process. The other thing that we do at that same time, at the same time as this application, seal of approval application, is going through, is that we work with you and the partner to calculate the amount of carbon that we estimate will be sequestered by this project. This is a photograph of one of our partner sites in Ghana, around just south of Kumasi in central Ghana. So that's the tree planting. So there you've got the tiny seedlings they're planting. The next photograph shows one of our partners, James Blay, with one of his one-year-old tree that was planted the year before. And the next picture is not the same tree and not the same partner, but it is the same partner. It's a Rosh Ghana, but it's a different site. It's an older site, but that's a 6-year-old off-ram tree. It's a mahogany tree. So what we need to do is to work out how much carbon is locked up in that process of going from a seedling to a mature tree. And the way we do that is we use a piece of software that we have developed, and is, yeah, there you go. There's a sheet from it. It's called Sequester. Name's on the tin. And essentially what we're doing is that behind Sequester, we have got an enormous amount of data. So we have access to an enormous amount of data. So what we would ask for in the application process is the location of the site. When we have the grid reference of the site, we can then generate what's called an environmental stress factor, which is essentially a number which determines the rate at which the growth rates of trees, depending on the altitude, and the climate. We also have the soil database in there, the world soil database in there, so we know what kind of soil they're likely to be growing on. We also ask our local tree advisors, or the partners of tree advisors, for their anticipated growth rates of the trees, because they will know what rates trees generally grow at in that area, and we plug that in. And then we need to know the tree species, which will determine have an impact on the growth rate. Also, then we need to know the number of trees and the density, the way in which they're planted, and any thinning that is likely to take place if it's a commercial crop. So we kind of plug all of that information in, as it were, to generate, you can see here an example of the anticipated growth rates of this is one particular site. This is actually in Kenya, where there's just 2 species of tree. You can see at the bottom. And as you can see, I mean, the key takeaway from this is that they grow very slowly at the beginning. Clearly, these are tiny seedlings just getting going. The next, from years 5 to 10 and then 10 to 15, the trees the growth rates take off. The buffer is what we hold back in reserve. We don't count that amount of tree growth, because that is held as in a stock to counteract any losses on other sites. So the total sequestration is the green line at the top, and the carbos, the blue line in the middle, is what we're counting. So that's what we are anticipating is going to be generated by these trees over that lifespan. And you can see at the top the various numbers and statistics around that. There's a lot more to that spreadsheet, to that piece of software, and I'm happy to talk about it more, or Adrian maybe or Alice can answer your questions. I think we're now going to I'm going to pause for a moment and give people time to ask any questions.
Caroline, it's Alex Green here. I'm interested around the buffer. You talked about the buffer being against all projects. So are you creating a pool of carbos which would offset other projects not maturing the way you would, or are they a balloon payment at the end of the project you're actually operating on?
Really good question. So at the moment, the way the Climate Stewards projects work, it's a pool for all our projects. One of the questions we're going to be asking you and all your colleagues on this call and others at the end of this, and one of the as yet unresolved issues, is how we deal with this in this new system, this new Communion Forests, Anglican Alliance, Climate Stewards sort of combined project. We, and I can see Elizabeth nodding, we need to work out the best way to do this across these new group of projects. I think they will, my feeling at the moment is that any buffer like that would be probably have to be separated from our Climate Stewards current projects. It would need to be a Communion Forests buffer. But whether it's per project or whether it's across the other projects, we would need to work that one out. Does that make sense, Alex?
It's understandable. I'm not sure if it makes sense for an investor, because you are proportionally disadvantaged the larger the size of the project you bring to the table, which probably has a greater chance of survival, let's say. So it feels like without thinking it very seriously through, it looks as though you're subsidizing other projects.
Yeah, good point. Adrian, do you want to say something on that as the sequester developer, buffer manager?
Yeah, effectively both options are up for grabs. If we pull the carbon, and as you say, Alex, there might be reasons that investors might not like that because you're funding other projects. It depends on how overall the project is going to be viewed across all of the dioceses that will be involved. And I think there's going to have to be some flexibility in working out what we do with that.
And I think, yeah, just to say, we're going to come on, Alex, later on. Elizabeth's going to talk a bit more about the funding and those options, so we can probably cover that a bit more. Any other questions on the seal of approval?
Can I ask a question? You suggested that there was good response from project partners in the majority world, but I think I heard you say you're just looking for 5 sites for this pilot project. Is that right? So do you think you'll be oversubscribed?
Shall I take that one, Caroline, or do you want to?
Go ahead.
So we had a lot of interest and a lot of expressions of interest. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily translate into actual applications. We have tried to, in this initial phase, not to advertise it across the whole communion to everybody for fear of exactly that, oversubscription. And what we don't want to do is raise expectations just to let people down. We want to avoid that. So we've tried to tread a middle path of approaching, sending out a relative, the invitation to a certain number. We are going to have to wait and find out, but we've also been doing some one-to-one conversations as well to see where the interest lies and where there might be potential for partnership. We're going to be seeing. Don't know if you want to add to that, Caroline. It's probably not a very satisfactory answer, but it's we're trying to tread that line between not disappointing people, but having enough interest that we've got enough for this first phase of piloting.
Yeah, I think the only thing to add to that is that, as you will have read in our briefing document, we've got this upfront funding, a small amount of funding from the Big Give charity, which we're going to distribute, as it were, to the 5 pilots. But it doesn't mean to say that others can't go ahead without that funding, because that will only be a contribution towards a larger cost anyway.
And that is a very good point, that one of the things we have been saying to the potential partners is that the actual process of thinking it all through is quite a good, it's a really neat way of actually thinking about a forestry project, and there might be, people might be able to go ahead if they can find funds from elsewhere.
Yeah, I think the reason why I'm asking is how we can leverage the existing relationships and trust that makes up the Anglican Communion through the Partners in World Mission scheme. So, but I completely understand that you need a project that's going to work financially, but however those relationships can be built into future relationships, you've got it just feels like a massive benefit to the Partners in World Mission links.
I think that's right, and that's certainly something we have been very much focusing on, and that will be part of our considerations with lots of conversation around it. So that's a really helpful question. Thank you. If any, Godfrey Armitage, please go ahead.
Yeah, just looking at, well, following on really from Mark's question and thinking about the train coming down the line, I've got in front of me milestones from the route map to net zero carbon by 2030, and offsetting. You're probably aware that one of the things is national parish buying to identify an approved supplier list for carbon offsets by 2025, and then by 2030 to implement carbon offsetting with an approved supplier to offset those emissions that have been impossible to eliminate. So as diocese, that's the sort of thing we're working towards. I've certainly been promoting Climate Stewards, generally speaking, when I speak on behalf of a Russia or as DEO in our diocese. And that seems to be just an ongoing thing, but these are special projects. And following on from Mark, it does seem that we're looking at just a fairly limited sort of what seems to be just a trial. So is it planned that this will be expanded greatly once this trial is over? Because there may be a whole load of dioceses sort of jumping up and down saying, we've got in 2025 to have some sort of reasonable response to the demand for carbon offsets, which ultimately will come into place in 2030.
That is exactly our hope, that we want to try it out on a smaller scale and that is absolutely our hope, that we can expand this in the future once we know how to make it work really well. Yeah.
So we should just keep on promoting Climate Stewards, generally speaking, but also should we be looking, therefore, also to be promoting this within our diocese without wanting to precipitate a great rush, which will overwhelm you? That's the problem.
I think we would love you to be promoting this, please, within your diocese. And if we get to the point of it being full, then obviously that is a very, very nice problem to have if it is fully funded. We look forward to that. And then, yes, I would strongly recommending the Climate Stewards more generally.
Great.
I can see a question from Nagalan Nazir and from Richard Nicholson. I saw Nagalan first. I'm going to go to you. Sorry, Richard.
Oh, I have a funding question. Should I wait until you finish your
Yes, please, please hold funding questions for the time being. Richard, Nicholson, is your question to do with the kind of process, the rigor side?
Yes, I'm just wondering whether this rather nifty software that you've developed, whether you're pushing it further to measure the carbon drawdown from natural systems that work faster than trees. We really haven't got time now to just continue planting trees and stopping forests being cut down, because we need, as the IPCC said, draw down billions of tons of carbon dioxide this decade. Now, if we were concentrating on regrowing mangrove and kelp and seagrass, and above all, farmers to change their methods of farming so as to retain soil and water, we could do a lot in drawdown. But I just wonder whether you have in mind how you might measure the drawdown from such projects?
At the moment, Sequester deals solely with carbon sequestration in sort of forestry, but there's always scope to expand. For us, what it mostly depends on is being able to back up any calculations and any claims with hard data. So if we can work with people who know what they're talking about, who can guide us to make the right kind of calculations, yes, we can build that kind of thing in.
And I should just add that there is, we have had interest from across the communion precisely on mangroves, especially small island states. That's the way they want to grow, to go. And just to also expand a little bit more broadly, this is just this project with Climate Stewards is just one tiny part of what the communion forest is all about, but exactly those things you've talked about, the restoration of other ecosystems, is the broader whole point of the communion forest. It's not just about trees, it's about prairie grasses, it's about mangroves, it's about seagrass, whatever is appropriate in the context. So that is very much our emphasis more broadly. May I suggest we move on? Oh, sorry, come back, Richards, I'm sorry.
I was just wondering, this is all being put down to parish and diocese level for getting the funding.
Mm-hmm.
Shouldn't our main aim be to get the church commissioners to unlock some of the billions of pounds they are hanging on rather than using? Because we have a climate emergency. The time to use that money is now. And with all the Anglican communion links around the world, we could use it very well.
I would recommend you advocate with the church commissioners. As the Anglican Alliance, we work at a communion level rather than, we can't get involved in advocacy within any national church, but thank you. It's a really important points, well made, thank you. May I suggest we move on to the second bit so we don't run out of time, but these questions are hugely important and this is not the end of the conversation. Please keep your questions coming in. We can pick up afterwards. So I'm going to be looking at a few little aspects. So first of all, moving on to the money side of it. So where will the money come from is the first question. As Caroline's already mentioned, that we have some seed funding available, but the majority of what we need is going to come from people across the Anglican communion, the whole of the Anglican communion, who are interested in supporting this. In this pilot phase, as has been mentioned, we want to raise enough money to establish up to 5 new projects. And if I might have, thank you. And what we need is enough to get them from launch to being established. And that means enough money to get them from the idea phase through to the point where the trees are sequestering or locking up measurable amounts of carbon, which is usually somewhere around 5 years after planting. Before we go for launch, we want to be confident that we have enough money available for this key startup period. As obviously what we don't want to, we need to know that we can fund into the medium term. We can't just raise enough for the first year and then realize we can't keep supporting. We've got to have enough in reserves for those first 5 years. And this is going to be something in the range of £5,000 to £10,000 per project. Obviously, that is going to depend on the location, which ones are actually chosen, the scale of the project, and variations in local costs. And this is around, this £5,000 to £10,000 is about half of the overall lifetime cost of the projects, because they are front heavy in terms of the financing, which isn't hard to sort of work out why, sorry. So the reason that the first half is top heavy is the one where the majority or 50% goes is because of the degree of monitoring and the startup costs. And also Climate Stewards builds in a buffer for inflation as well into that, so into the costs. Then beyond that initial funding, which is obviously our first focus, we are also looking for funding into the medium and longer term. So we are looking for people who want to help with the startup, but also are interested in supporting into the longer term too. Because obviously the projects need that long-term funding to enable them to continue. So if we move on to what the money is going to be used for, I think you've already got a really good idea of this from the budget that Caroline has already shared. So we're looking for money for the local partners, allowing them to set up and establish those projects, the seedlings, the due diligence, the getting in the experts, the training, all of that. But that's not the only place where the money is going. Part of any money that's raised also needs to help to cover the costs to Climate Stewards. Obviously, this is an involved process of measuring and so on, and there are costs to them, and they have to be enabled. I think one thing to stress in that one of the reasons I love Climate Stewards is that the way they work with partners, it's a very iterative process. So we're not just sending out application packs and waiting for people to send them back. They really invest in talking with the partners and helping them understand the process and go through it. So that takes time. And also Climate Stewards need to build and develop the seal of approval process. So there are costs. That's the second area that the money is going to be used for. And the third question that we want to explore with you and to ask about is we would like to include a small, moderate percentage coming to the communion forest. Well, why? Because also it costs money to keep our two facilitators going and so on, and we need to be able to fund the ongoing work of the communion forest. So that is where we would like money to be. As time goes on, as we know what those costs are, we will be able to be, we're aiming to be transparent, so you know the percentages of where it all goes, but we need you to know where the money is going. So the final question I want to just address is, can you use your donation for carbon offsetting? Well, you'll be unsurprised to hear that the answer is yes, based on the whole premise of the project, that this is a project funded by carbon offsetting. So yes, you may use your donation for your own carbon footprint offsetting if you wish. I think the way we're liking to think about this project is that it's about allowing new tree growing initiatives to happen, that in time are going to lock up carbon. So this is really a project that's about forward planning, thinking ahead. So you could think of it in terms of your donation reserving or pre-ordering sequestered carbon, because you're doing something now, but it's for the future. So yes, you can use it as your carbon footprint to offset your carbon footprint, but how and when you choose to claim that carbon offset is entirely up to you. You can do it from the outset. You can do it when you know those projects, yes, they really are locking up carbon. So when you choose to claim them is up to you. The papers that we've shared have a rather complicated way of explaining that, but essentially what we're saying is that this is locking up carbon for the future, and you can use that either now or in the future as part of your carbon offsetting. The other option is actually not to use it for carbon offsets, but just say this is a great idea. We want to enable Anglicans around the communion to start more tree growing projects that will benefit their communities, that they can use for carbon sequestration, and it will help them, but actually just have the money. So that's another option too. We will take care to make sure that no carbon is double counted, that if it is used as an offset by somebody, that's it. It can't be, we will be rigorous around that. So I think that's the overview of how the funding side will work. We have some questions for you, but I would love to have your questions first before we move on. And can I just pick up the question I've just spotted in the chat from Scott Barker? Is the £5,000 to £10,000 figure an estimate of the initial startup cost or the total investment over the life of the project? And Alice has answered, and yes, that is the 50%. That's about the half. That's the initial 5-year costs. That's what we want to get in the bank before hit and go.
And just to clarify on that, I mean, obviously, how big is a project? That, you know, how long is a piece of string? But that's based on a number of the projects that we are working with at the moment. So, for example, the one I showed you with the schools, the church planting, tree planting, that's in southeast Kenya, where they're planting these kind of roughly 0.5 hectare to 1 hectare plots around the church. Their current phase of planting involves 4 church sites, and the budget for that is around £6,000 in the first 5 years, and another 6 over the next 50, well, for the remaining 10. So that's kind of a very rough breakdown. We've got other bigger partnerships going on as well, but in terms of these pilots, we're looking for that sort of scale of project because we think that's a realistic, that's what we want to be replicating over and over again.
Thanks, Alice. Any other questions? One thing just to say again, we will have the recording available afterwards. If you need to go, please, we won't be offended. We will be carrying on until we've answered questions and just finish, but if you need to go, please do. Other questions? Martin.
Yeah, just to be clear about the funding side and the long-term funding.
Yes.
I mean, if 5,000 to 10,000 is what it takes to get through the first half of or to get through the first 5 years, so your upfront costs and everything, it suggests that actually what you're looking for overall is £10,000 to £20,000, because if you stop after 5 years, you stop supporting it, there's a risk of the project just failing.
Indeed. So that's why we're looking for the longer term commitment, but and we'd be interested in your thoughts. But when we've been talking about this, we felt that having 20 years worth of money in the bank from the beginning might just be too much. And it also, but what it means for the funders is that you might like to be thinking to the long term and say, we are going to commit to donating whatever amount per year after the first tranche.
Yeah, I think
we were trying to get the balance between needing to plan for the long term, but not overwhelm people by the demand or just have a huge amount of money sitting in the bank actually not going to be released.
Oh, sure. No, I appreciate that, but there's a difference between what you're saying you'd like to have in the bank to start the thing off.
Yes.
But also, if you're actually going to, as funders, are going to commit to this, you need to be aware that we're talking twice that sum of money in order to complete the project.
Exactly that. Thank you. That's really helpful.
There is also an element to kind of bear in mind that if your trees reach 5 years, there's a very, very good chance that they'll get to the end of the project as well, because communities start to have more evidence of the benefit to themselves and are more inclined to engage, which means if for some reason funding is lesser, you can potentially stretch out monitoring periods and still meet your objectives. But ideally, yeah, you fund it in full.
Do you have a sense of the yield of this sort of marquee size of plots, or the sort of 2-acre plot, and what do you estimate the cost, the actual carbon cost is, given that you've put in £20,000?
So for these 4 sites in Kenya, roughly speaking, they will generate around 1,000 ton. We call them carbos. So we use a word, carbos. It's a made-up word, and it's basically a ton of carbon avoided or sequestered. So those 4 sites will generate around 1,000 tons over the lifespan of the project. That's 15 years. Now the reality is they'll probably grow for longer than that. So we're being more conservative. The reality is also we've knocked off that buffer of around, I think, 28% in this case, depending, they vary according to the risk matrix. So that we've got 1,000 tons of carbon promised in the future, as it were, on day 1, day 0. That's what we're anticipating over the life of the project. And in this particular case, if you put, inputting all the costs of that project over that 15-year period, that cost per ton of that carbon comes out at £8.15 per ton. So this is not the cheapest carbon you can buy. You could go on the world market and buy it for $5 a ton. But it's certainly not the most expensive if you go and compare carbon offset projects, and if you go to all the people who are selling carbon offsets, you could be paying 20, 30, 40, 50, 100. And as you know, the world, the real cost of carbon is considerably higher than that. So there's a huge range, and these projects are deliberately, we want to make sure that we cover all the costs, because we want to make sure they're really holistic and that they bring those benefits alongside the trees. So that's the cost of us to fund the project. That wouldn't be the cost that we would sell it at, because obviously that doesn't include what Elizabeth talked about, which is the Climate Stewards overhead, which is us running this whole, running Climate Stewards and running the seal of approval, and any donations to the communion forest, etc. But that's the contract price with the partner.
Thank you.
So I'd like to pick up Cynthia McChesney's question. Would you like to actually say it so we have your voice and not just ours? That would be great.
Well, I'm just thinking from the perspective of grants committees and individual donors. So, if a church diocese were to donate for a project, would it go to a single project that then we could talk about, the picture of the man standing with the tree? And then would they receive updates, or is it more goes into the pool and you're participating in this project?
Well, we could have planted you to ask that question because this is exactly one of the things we want to find out from you. So at the moment, we are exploring the 2 possibilities. One is a direct relationship with one project where essentially you take all the risk as well as the relationship. And we're also exploring the model of a pooled pot of the up to the 5. We want, through the Communion Forest and Climate Stewards, to develop that relationship. And as has already been expressed, I think it was Alex who talked about that. We already have the companionship links where there is that relationship. So we want to explore both possibility of a pool and individuals, but we want to pick up from people like you is, what do you think? What would work best for you? And that's one of the questions I'm going to be feeding to you afterwards. But in either case, we will be providing information and updates. So even if it's a pool, we will be talking about the pool, because part of the point of the Communion Forest is about joining together in relationship across the communion in caring for creation, in joining together in the 5th mark of mission. It's about partnership, and the relationship is a key part of that. This isn't a transactional thing. This is all about assets, that people in some parts of the world have the asset of a tropical region where trees grow well. People in other parts of the communion have the asset of money, funding, and they have the need to offset their carbon. So we're seeing this as a way, as the communion, it's something we can do that very few other people can do, is that we can connect. And so the relationship is key, and whichever model we go for, we will be sharing updates and sharing it within our capacity as the communion forest to do that. I should say, one of the reasons we're seeking your thoughts on donations to the communion forest is that we have a small team and very little funding. And so we need to make sure that we are sustainable into the long term too.
You might think about a hybrid model too, where people can, support and it, so it would be set up to support the whole, but also individual. I really do feel that if folks were supporting a single project, there's a chance for a church or donors or a diocese to really want to do more there, right? And to learn more about that group beyond climate issues and build relationships. So, I think there's a real opportunity there with being able to connect a, resourced church in the US with a project, especially church-based in the tropics, that could lead to a greater sense of just our shared, human and Christian belief.
Thank you. I think that's a really helpful insight. So please, when I send out the questionnaire, please sort of answer that question and as much detail as possible. But thank you so much, Cynthia. That's a really helpful question.
And Nagaland's got his hand up.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Nagaland. I didn't see that. Sorry.
No, a related question, and it's partly projecting timeline. I heard you say, Elizabeth, that the first opportunity to start claiming, if you wanted to claim carbon, the first opportunity would be to claim sequestered carbon after 5 years, right? And I see in Caroline's chart that there is very little in the first few years, and then it exponentially grows. So that's fine. And then the second part of the question is that, in the chart, it goes up to 15 years. And do we, as a funder, then claim each year's carbon after the initial investment for that same initial group of trees, or do we pay annually to sort of claim each subsequent year's sequestration? And it's both the investment question, but also an ethical question on what's the right thing to do. And some sort of an annual top-up after the first 5 years may address Martin's concerns about making sure that the second half funding is also secure. So, questions?
Do you want me to, shall I answer? So Nagaland, I think in answer to the question about when you can claim the carbon, you could claim the carbon. We have projects where we are, as it were, claiming the carbon ex ante, which means in advance, so at year zero. So it's the promise of future carbon sequestration. A lot of organizations, particularly, and this is why we sort of tailored it like this for the Anglican Communion, is that certainly the Church of England has set its net zero target at 2030. So from 2030 onwards, churches and dioceses need to be compensating for their carbon. So they don't need, in general, unless they choose to, they don't have to be doing that. They don't have to claim the carbon. However, in order to get the trees growing, obviously, then we need to start investing now, which is why we're starting now and not in 5 years' time. In terms of your question about the ongoing payments, so going back to that budget of £12,000 for that, it's a relatively small. These are pilot projects, and I think clearly, if we're going to be dealing with everybody's carbon footprint, they're going to get a lot bigger faster. But initially, those small ones, that initial payment, if that comes out at the beginning, and then the remainder has to come out over the next few years, so that would be an annual payment of the budgeted amount to claim the remainder of, to claim the anticipated, those 1,000 tons of carbon, essentially, which is the ex ante amount for the 15-year project life. There is another issue, which is that because we've used very conservative figures in our estimates, it is highly likely, but not guaranteed, that projects will actually generate more tons of carbon than we anticipate. They will then, in the future, be able to sell what we call ex post carbon. So they've actually counted and measured the trees. And if we anticipated, say, 1,000 tons, they may realize that actually those trees have grown bigger and they've got 1,500 tons. So they can sell some extra carbon credits when the trees have grown that big. So when they get beyond their 1,000, they can start selling their own ex post, so after the event, carbon credits. So that's a sort of an extra development in the future. But in terms of organizations funding these projects, yeah, you would be paying year on year to complete the payment of that budget for those ex ante credits.
Do you foresee an issue that when the funding stops in 15 years, your partner decides to use the forest for something else?
When you say use it for something else, you mean cut it down?
Cut it down.
Well, I suppose the point about that is that most of the partnerships which, when we're just reaching this point with our earliest partners, where they're now 5 years. Well, no, sorry, the Roshigana sites, the original Roshigana sites are much bigger. As people realize the value of the timber and the fact that it's more valuable as a tall straight tree than it is as firewood, for example, the incentive is to either let it grow bigger or to replant it immediately, where it's going to do the same thing again. It's going to sequester carbon beyond that. We cannot anticipate. We took a decision a long time ago that 15 years was the sort of furthest into the future we could project, because life moves on and it's just too far ahead. There are too many uncertain, unknown risks beyond that date. What we hope is that in 15 years' time, everything will, things will have changed. This whole idea will have got more traction, and people will increasingly just be planting trees because they know that they can generate more tons of carbon in the future. So I think the risk of them, well, if they did cut the forest down, for a start off, they have an agreement that says they won't. Now, clearly, we can't enforce that agreement. That's an agreement of trust. And there will be times when a church, for example, wants to plant some trees and then decides and plans to keep them there, but then decides actually they want to build another building or a car park or whatever. So things do happen. We recognise that, and that to some extent that's built into the risk buffer. But there could be cases, and that's I guess why we come back to the pooling, is that you could lose the whole lot on one site, whether that's due to a cyclone or a development project. But on the other sites they'll do much better. So that's kind of the logic for the pooling. In terms of the motivation to cut things down, actually, even if they do fell the trees, they will be most valuable as timber for construction or furniture or electricity poles or whatever, which means that carbon remains locked up. When we do the calculations, we only calculate what they call the merchantable stem volume, which is the tall straight trunk bit. We always assume that the branches and the thinnings and all the dead bits and all the sort of shavings off the side get burnt. We're only counting the sort of core of the trunk anyway. So we're trying to be very conservative on that too.
Thank you.
May I suggest that we just pop onto this slide of our questions to you so you can anticipate what we're going to be asking afterwards, and then we'll just finish up quickly to give you an idea of timelines. So the questions that we would as we find out across the communion what kind of interest there is in this and where people are, we're going to be asking people about, do you know what your carbon footprint is? How far along that path are you? Do you know your time scales in terms of when you're likely to be wanting to offset? Then coming back to that question about the relationship, do you have an established relationship with an overseas partner? And we can think about that. And actually, do you already have a project in mind that you'd like to link up with? And we know there are a couple of examples of that. Then the question around this basket or direct link to one project. So we're going to be asking you about that. What would work best for you? Do you want to take a direct link to one project, which means that you're taking on all the risk, or do you prefer the idea of things being in a basket of pooled risk, but as we said before, being kept up to date with how all of them are going? We're going to ask you about, do you want to do this as offsets, or actually is there are people thinking about, well, actually we like it, we're just going to donate? And then to ask this question about, how do you feel about giving a modest percentage to the Communion Forest Initiative as well to help us keep that going? The donation towards the costs of Climate Stewards are built in. They have to, that's non-negotiable. It can't work without that. So those are the questions we're going to be asking you, and I'm just going to pass back to Caroline for the timeline, and so we can let you go to whatever it is you have next.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So just to finish, really, this we think is what we're looking at for a timeline. So in this month and next month, we will be sending out application packs to potential partners. We've already sent some, well, we're about to send some as a result of last week's webinar, and there may be more that come in. And you may know of partners yourself who would be interested. And if you yourself would like to receive a pack to see what it looks like, we're very happy to do that too. There would then be, as Elizabeth said, this is an iterative process, and what we find is there's a lot of hand-holding, a lot of conversations that go on backwards and forwards between us and the potential partner to help them work through the pack, work out what a project might look like. What we tend to do is a sort of back of the envelope, as it were, sequester calculation. So once we know the scale of what the project they're thinking of, so roughly species, numbers, location, etc., we put that through sequester to work out roughly how many tons of carbon that project will lock up. Then they know when they're putting together their budget whether or not it's going to be viable. And obviously, in terms of the sale price of the carbon, which is usually, it's likely to be £25, then that we need to make sure that these costs are covered. And just to say that figure of £8 I quoted is one of our cheapest projects. So a lot of them go up to about £15 per tonne. So it depends enormously on the location and all sorts of other factors which they'll put into that budget, and what general, what local costs are, whether it's for fuel or salaries and everything else. So by the end of February, we'd like to see, that's the deadline we're setting for the applications, for the seal of approval applications for this pilot phase, where we're looking to fund or to award seed funding to 5 projects. We'll select those in March, and then there will be some further toing and froing. So hopefully the seal of approval application will be awarded to those projects somewhere around May, which enables them to get planning and preparing in order to start planting, well, depending on the location, but in the rainy season, whether that's probably September, October, November this time next year, essentially. So we would set, that's when the money would go out, assuming we've got the money in, which is obviously important. And then we move into an annual reporting cycle where we require a 6-month report for initial planting, just to say, yep, the trees are in the ground. What went wrong? That all those questions around how did it go, and then we move into an annual monitoring cycle. The initial years are literally the trees are there, they're alive or they're dead. Essentially, that's all we're asking. We ask questions around that, but that's the basic thing. After about 5 years, when the trees reach 10 centimeters DBH diameter at breast height, so a reasonable size, then we start to ask for measurements of the tree, so we can start to kind of check the actual growth against our anticipated growth rates. And the funds are sent every year on receipt of satisfactory monitoring. And just to say, with the seal of approval, it is rigorous. Over the years now, there are 2 partners which we've had to essentially say, we're really sorry, but we cannot award a seal of approval on going onwards for this project, because we've tried to mitigate things, we've tried to fix problems, we've supported partners a bit to help them with that, but this project is just not working. So it is rigorous, and that's important that we maintain that high standard.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Caroline. And so from the funding point of view, obviously, we're going to need to have the funds in place to allow that to happen along those timescales too. So thank you all so much for your time. It's hugely appreciated that you've taken the time to come and listen and to ask questions. As I've said in the chat, please keep the questions coming. I hope you can see that we've been working hard to try and get this as right as we can, but it is very helpful to have your questions and perspectives, because we want this to work, and so your insights and questions and challenging us on how it should happen are very, very welcome. So please keep those coming to us by email afterwards. We will share the recording next week with you. The recording of the webinar that we held last week for the growing partners is already on the Communion Forest YouTube channel. So if you want to go and see that, that's already available. But we will be in touch in due course. So thank you, and God bless. And it's wonderful to know we've got fellow travellers and people who love God's wonderful creation and want to care and want to work together. Thank you very much.